All right, we're recording now. Good morning, guys.
Morning.
Last week, we spent some time looking at what book of the Bible were we in?
Romans.
Specifically, we were in Romans chapter 8, and we were focusing on probably the most impactful, although not the only, certainly not the only verses in Scripture that relate to the concept of how salvation works when it comes to what we will eventually come to call here and have been calling and will continue to call Calvinism versus Arminianism. So does anybody remember just generally what we talked about? One of the challenges is what's trying to be balanced here when theologians look at this question of the role of God and the role of man in salvation.
Well, we talked about election and free will and just the conundrum.
Go ahead, Donna.
Who he chooses.
Yeah. Even the more fundamental question of who gets to choose, right?
He gets to choose.
He gets to choose. But do we get any choice? He gets to choose, but do we get any choice? This is one of the things that, is I don't want to use the word conundrum. I actually prefer the term from something that I was reading this week. I prefer the term mystery versus conundrum.
Yeah, that's a better word.
It's a conundrum to us only because it's a mystery.
Right.
And that, ties back to if Sherry were here, she'd throw this in, I know, for good measure, because I've heard her do it often enough, and I certainly believe it. The fact that we don't understand it is our fault. It doesn't put anything on God. The fact that we can't understand God's ways is because he's God and we're not.
Right.
And we also, by the way, we don't often like that answer. I don't like that answer necessarily, but that doesn't make that answer any less true.
Right.
And so that's the important thing to understand. And so the recognition here also is, we sometimes when we come to this topic, we've come to it a number of times and we're coming to it again now. We also want to think, and this is going to be mentioned today in the resource that we use, that Calvinism and Arminianism are so far apart on the theological spectrum. And the answer is no, they're really not.
No.
They both fall within the scope of Reformed theology in a broad sense, although that term Reformed now today tends to refer more towards a Calvinistic position. We'll better define what that is here as we go through today, versus an Arminian position, but all fall within the broad category of Reformed theology. And while there are important distinctions there, they are not so far apart that they are, I would even argue they're not even so far apart that they're incompatible. Their incompatibility exists in what I was just talking about, our inability to understand things that God understands that we're not capable of understanding. And so I just want to say that right up front. It's easy to turn this into like some big chasm or divide, and it's an important division in how theologians have worked things out since, Calvin and the others of this time brought it forward. But it's also not such a thing that we need to think of it as being, I guess, as divisive today as we're going to see that it was before. Does that make any sense? And this is also one of those things, I'm actually going to very heavily rely today upon one of these situations where I'm actually going to use a video to lead us through the teaching part, because it is so far superior to what I would do trying to recapsulate what's in the video. And what's the point of bringing it through me as the messenger and losing something in translation? So today I'm going to heavily use probably won't even get through all of it today, but a video that's part of the series from the Gordon Cornwell thing that I've posted before. This is Dr. Ryan Reeves. And this is going to have both a historical bent, and then we're going to get over into Calvin Arminian discussion. As he points out very early on in the video, it's important to understand the historical context that Jacobus Arminius rose up in, and that's the context of being Dutch in the Netherlands and what was going on in the Netherlands. So this is one of those things, unfortunately, where you're going to have to endure a little history to get a better understanding of your theology. So I apologize right up front for that. But I'm gonna go ahead and start that video. And as I've done in the past, not just let it run through, we'll start and stop and discuss it. But this is going to start off talking about the history of what's called the Dutch Revolt. So we're in the Netherlands, and it sets the historical backdrop for a lot of what's going on between the rise of Arminian thought in opposition to Calvinist thought. So for those of you that aren't as history inclined, I apologize right now for the history, but I think you'll see that it's vital. So this is going to run for about 10 or 11 minutes just on the history side. Then we're going to stop and discuss that before we slide over into the theology side. So if somebody will let me know once I start the video that you guys are being able to hear it okay, that will also be an important step of what we're doing here. I do have the share sound checked, so we should.
Okay. Okay. Bill muted.
Y'all hear that?
In this lecture, we're looking at the Dutch Revolt and the Armenian Revolution. And the reason why we're looking at both of these together is because too often Arminianism as a theological perspective is considered either apart from its initial history, or when it's looked at in the context of the life of Arminius or the Synod of Dort, it's too often considered apart from the wider revolution in the Netherlands that split down the middle, the northern Protestant Netherlands from the southern area that was Catholic that would eventually become known as Belgium. And so what we're going to look at in this lecture is the combination of these two events, because you really can't understand one without the other. At the very least, it is impossible to understand the rise of what we today call classic Arminianism apart from the Dutch revolt against the Holy Roman Empire. And to begin, we're going to look at the politics of this, what's going on in terms of the culture and in terms of the wars there in the Netherlands. The story of the Netherlands actually begins back in the 16th century. In 1549, Charles V, who was the reigning emperor of the Holy Roman Empire at the time, issued what has become known as the Pragmatic Sanction. And the Pragmatic Sanction essentially detached the Netherlands themselves from the governance of France. And so Charles split what became known as the 17 provinces, which de facto make up the Netherlands, into a separate jurisdiction. A lot of the need for this is because the Netherlands at the time and increasingly into the 17th century is incredibly wealthy, and to be something of a vassal or to have its governance determined off-site, you might say, was beginning to chafe them a bit. And so Charles in 1549 grants them a certain jurisdictional independence. Now, the area of the Netherlands is still under the Habsburg dynasty, and so as the war within the Netherlands erupts, and as there begin to evolve some change and some need for separation within.
I have to pause here just because it's in my head, and until I say it, I can't get it out of my head. So this is purely self-indulgent. That's a picture of Charles V, who's the Holy Roman Emperor. He's of the Habsburg family, the Habsburg dynasty. And you'll notice that he has the beard there, the very prominent beard. A genetic trait of the Habsburgs was they had these really massive chins. I mean, massive chins. So that beard is partly covering the quote unquote Habsburg chin. So if you ever hear that term, the Habsburg chin, you'll understand these folks had, just because of genetic traits and a lot of the cousins marrying cousins thing that was going on, and recessive traits. You could spot a Habsburg ruler almost a mile away because the chins were that big. There really are discussions about that. So there's your history trivia for the day that I couldn't get out of my head as long as there was a picture of him with the big beard.
Don, is that Charles V that was involved with Luther?
Yes, this is the same Charles V. He was the this is 1549. So we are what? We are 35 years removed, a little bit more than 30, almost 35 years removed from the tacking of the theses. Charles V is the emperor that's behind the scenes while all of this is going on. So he is more involved than any leader in Europe in terms of having to deal with the rise of the Protestant Reformation, in terms of Luther, in terms of Calvin. even though he's now granted this autonomy to these provinces that we will eventually know as that are the Netherlands, we'll eventually know as Holland or the Netherlands, or I mean, that even gets more complicated what to call them over time. He's the one that runs all the way through. His son, we're going to see that reference here in a little bit. His son is Philip II of Spain, who is also very involved. So the Habsburg family is the family that is ruling large parts of Europe, either as the Holy Roman Emperor or other large nation states at this time.
In the 17 provinces, this should be seen as a war to finally and fully get rid of Habsburg rule in the area of the Netherlands. And as we carry it forward, a number of things began to happen, both in terms of culture and politics and in terms of religion, that eventually set the stage for the Dutch revolt. In 1556, Charles actually abdicates the Holy Roman Empire, and he leaves to his son Philip of Spain, as he is known.
Again, I'm going to continue to do this because I just don't want it to be, Ryan Reeves going on, although he's better than I am. One of the things that jumps out here, this is the map is it's just their map. Notice the green areas. This is when he eventually divides it, how things will be as well. But notice that what's different about this as an empire? What jumps out at you immediately?
It's too spread out.
Not everything is directly connected. There's Spain down here on the Iberian Peninsula. There's parts of what we think of as modern day Italy in the form of Naples and Sicily and Sardinia. There's these parts of the German principalities up here, Bohemia, etc. The areas we think of as modern day Czechoslovakia. Now we're over here into Hungary and Romania in terms of a modern sense. Oh, and by the way, the Netherlands and this little bitty area sort of here in northern Italy, moving up towards Switzerland, but definitely not Switzerland, not the Swiss Confederacy. It's spread out. So even though it's all underneath Habsburg rule, it's not connected in the same way that you might think of as a modern empire. And so, for example, here's the Netherlands disconnected from Spain, disconnected from the German and Eastern European territories. It was a divided empire.
And where was Charles at?
Charles reigned most of the time from up here in the area of what we think of as being modern day Germany.
Governance of, amongst other areas, the Netherlands themselves. Now, we came across Philip before in our story of Mary I or Mary Tudor up in England. Philip wed Mary, and of course, a lot of the ongoing tussling back and forth was grounded on the fact that Philip, being a devout Catholic, believed that Protestantism needed to be purged from any of his lands. But the problem is that so many areas have been accommodating for years to the Protestant message. In particular, in the 1560s, Protestantism began to put down deep roots in the Netherlands. Various cities, particularly in the northern provinces, began to take on a very serious tone, very serious commitment. Now, the Netherlands are a bit of a melting pot. By and large, most trend towards reformed positions on things, though there are Anabaptists as well as Protestants of a more generic stripe that are difficult to pin down in one camp or the other. Well, as the wars there in the Netherlands begin to emerge, as the revolt itself begins to take shape, a lot of this back and forth between Protestantism and the Catholic governorship over the Netherlands becomes the central feature of the revolt itself. The man who would come to define the early revolt and who would eventually give it its Protestant cast is a man by the name of William of Orange, also known as William the Silent. William was part of the nobility. He was a powerful man and a real committed leader of not only of the culture that was calling for the separation from the Habsburg Catholic rulers, but also of the armies themselves. The way the story unfolds is when William comes.
Key point there, it's in there, just want to make sure I emphasize it. The Habsburgs favored which side? The side of the Catholic Church or the Protestants?
Catholic Church.
The Catholic Church. The Habsburgs, in the form of Charles V, who's the one that's interacting with Luther and with others, and later in the form of his son Philip II, they are the strongest supporters of the church in its existence prior to and even during the Reformation. They are on the Catholic side of everything that's happening theologically, but also, as we've talked about here, politics is interwoven all throughout this.
Don,
Into his power, whatever.
Yep.
I'm sorry, is Dutch referencing the Netherlands as a
Yeah,
whole?
so let me establish some terms here that I still struggle with. The managing director in my office is actually from the Netherlands. So he will refer to himself as being Dutch. And that's a broad description of the Netherlands. Understanding that, as was referenced before, modern day countries that we know today, Belgium and Luxembourg, were among the provinces at that time that were known as the Netherlands. Eventually, the Netherlands is going to split. You'll see this as we go through this into North and South. And it's primarily going to split along religious lines. The South is Catholic, the North is Protestant. And so they're all known generally as the Netherlands. For example, you've probably heard the reference to Holland, right? You think of the Netherlands, you think of Holland. Holland is actually the largest province inside of the Netherlands. So when you hear a reference to Holland, it's a little bit like saying, I guess the equivalent would be equating the United States by referencing some state and understanding what the connection is there. But the Netherlands is the broader country. Holland is just one of the provinces. It's the largest, one of the provinces inside of the Netherlands. But generally, Dutch is the language. That's a linking factor, is the Dutch language. But it's also the culture is connected across. So modern day Belgium's a little bit different, but Belgium is Dutch, even though it's a separate country in terms of its culture and its language.
Okay.
And this also interacts with the fact that those are the areas that are closest to France. And so it's the interaction with France over this particular period of time. And France is predominantly Catholic, except for the Huguenots, who are the Protestants that make a minority in France.
Where he comes to take the reins of authority of those in the North who are beginning to wage civil war in the effort to have separation. There were at the time really three factions in general. There were those who were Catholic, predominantly in the South. There were those who were more, we might use the word hardline Calvinist. That is to say, they were seriously committed to the Reformed position. And as often happens, there were those in the middle. Maybe they were Catholic, maybe they were Protestant, but for whatever reason, they simply wanted a modicum of separation, a modicum of independence, but not total war or a total separation of the Netherlands from the Catholic leaders in the Habsburg dynasty. William of Orange becomes pivotal, though, because as the years wear on, he does become himself a convert to Calvinism or to the Reformed faith. And the more hardline guys really take something of a violent tone here. And we can note, of course, that this is during the time of the Huguenots down in France. In some ways, this group parallels or is an analogy to the Huguenots in France. There are times where they will be relatively violent or at least relatively vocal when it comes to their faith. A great example of this is the spread of a certain amount of iconoclasm. These are mobs of Reformed folks committed to the destruction of images and art and these things in the context of worship, who will at times just break into churches and do it for everyone. They don't go through law and prudence because, again, in this day and age, the Habsburgs control the Netherlands, and so therefore they take matters into their own hands. Well, there's an awful lot of back and forth and ups and downs in these early days of the Civil Wars. William of Orange and Philip in particular tussle back and forth. Philip, of course, has no reason to give the Netherlands any independence from the Habsburg dynasty. And William of Orange is fighting something of a losing battle, though he is always at least fighting to a stalemate, or he conquers certain areas and declares that it is now freed. A real turning point, though, in these early days is that Spain eventually becomes bankrupt. They are unable to pay not only their own forces, but also the mercenary armies that they had hired to keep order and discipline there in the Netherlands. As a result of the bankruptcy in Spain, a number of the armies, particularly the mercenaries, go into utter revolt. They sack cities, they enact a short-term wave of violence, and as a result, this does seem to bring about a certain increase in anti-Catholic sentiment in the Netherlands. When the armies turn on you and attack those who are innocent, in the end, the only ones to blame are those to whom they answer. And so a number of folks, in particular in the North, begin to stress increasingly that they are more and more on the side of William of Orange and this Protestant desire for separation from the Habsburgs.
So here's a little bit blown up. So it's easier. See the large orange area up here? That is Holland as a province. So it's in the northern part. It will go with the break when there's the north-south break. But again, you'll see that these are various provinces and territories inside of the Netherlands. The other thing I wanted to hit on there was the realization that where was Spain's money coming from before this?
It had to be the New World.
Yep, all that gold in the New World. The gold in the New World changed a whole bunch of stuff. And eventually Spain reaches the point where they have exhausted that settled influx of wealth for lots of reasons. And that made a big change. And then they also pretty much bankrupted themselves in an event that happened slightly before this, which is they spend all that money on a big fleet of ships called the Spanish Armada in an effort to actually go and displace Elizabeth as the Protestant ruler of England. And that whole in fact, it's called the Enterprise by the Spanish. That's what they refer to it as, is a massive failure for all types of reasons. There's an excellent podcast episode on that on Fork in Time called Protestant Wind, for those of you that may be curious in some of the background for that. But actually, there's a big storm. It's all kinds of things that happen. But that changes the geoeconomic politics of Europe. When Spain doesn't have the money that it had before, as he talked about there, you can't pay mercenaries because mercenaries only fight for what reason? For money. And so when they turn, it changes things a lot. And it also changes the nature of the balance of things in Europe once in the late 16th century and into the early 17th century, when Spain loses as much of a wealth advantage that it had coming from the New World.
You said that the orange part is the biggest. Is it biggest by population? Because the red and the green look, and maybe even the yellow down here look bigger.
It's the largest by population. It's the most populated.
By population.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in fact, the capital of the modern Netherlands is in The Hague,
Right.
in Holland, which is also why sometimes it's referred to as Holland, even though it's the Netherlands. But it's Dutch. So there you go.
A lot of this first wave, though, comes to an end, but in a strange way galvanized in 1584. In 1584, on the 10th of July, William of Orange was assassinated. A man got in close to him, a man who would later be found out to be a Jesuit, and he puts 2 bullets through him, assassinating William of Orange, attempting to end his leadership of the revolt. If you go there today, you can actually see they have framed the spot where the 2 bullets passing through William's body actually lodged themselves into the wall. Well, as you can imagine, the assassination of William did nothing to alleviate the tension and the passion here, and it certainly didn't help that the man was Jesuit, part of the Catholic establishment, who had assassinated William. William of Orange's son takes over at this point, and he was William of Nassau. And so the years wear on with first Nassau and then others after him taking up the mantle of leadership. And it's to the point that by the end of the 16th century, historians like to say that there was a de facto or a real separation between the northern 7 provinces and the 10 southern provinces. Now, these 7 in the north and 10 in the south will be more or less the dividing line between the Protestant Netherlands to the north and Catholic Belgium to the.
And to Kathy's point, the other reason that Holland is bigger, because you couldn't see it on the other map, is the way that it extends out with the. And remember, what do we think of when we think about here? We think of windmills and we think of dikes and all of that. This is all. Well, yes, this is all very low land. So these areas. I remember having this conversation. This is the Louisiana of Europe. you know, you can't always tell the difference between land and water. It gets a little fuzzy sometimes. And that's sort of what's happening here.
The South. But needless to say, there is an ongoing back and forth between the North, which de facto, again, essentially has its own autonomy and its own authority, to eventually the culmination of the end of the Wars of Religion in 1648. We've mentioned this date several times throughout the lecture so far. It's in 1648 where you have proclaimed a more or less universal peace throughout Europe when it comes to these types of religious wars. And in 1648, the de facto separation of the 7 northern provinces becomes ironclad. It now becomes on the books the official separation to what was formerly a united Netherlands. Now, one last thing to say about the political tussling back and forth here. As we move forward into the religious elements of this, with the rise of Arminius, one of the things that the North is going to have to work out for itself is a new constitution, you might say, or a new order of business for itself. The earliest tussling in the northern Protestant provinces is what is the central locus of power? Is it in the regions? Is it in each of the 7 provinces? Or is there now a united national voice or a united national political order that will more or less impose down on top of the other 7 a central perspective on things? Now, this is going to matter politically, but it is also going to matter in terms of theology. As the rise of the Arminian debates come into existence here in the early 1600s, a lot of the back and forth between Arminianism or the Remonstrance faith and the Dutch Calvinists is going to churn on the question of to whom do they answer? Is it a matter to be decided in the local assembly, in the regional churches? Or should there be a national synod or a national meeting to decide issues related to, in this case, Arminianism?
Do you fully grasp how the things are all interweaving together there? There's going to be a theological debate, which is why we're studying this. But the theological debate is set in the context of a international struggle, in the sense of, should the Netherlands be free from the Holy Roman Empire and Habsburg domination, in this case domination by Spain under Philip? And even inside of the Netherlands, once they gain essentially their independence, if you will, as part of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, how that's going to work. So there's a political backdrop to this whole situation. And you can't get outside of that political backdrop or forget that political backdrop when you start talking about the theology, because it plays into it. Does that make sense? So it's one thing to say that Calvinists and those that are starting to adhere to some of the teachings and writings of Arminius are at each other over the theological question. They are at each other over the theological question. But at the same time, they're at each other over, should we have a national government and a national church? Or should we have a regional government and a regional church? All of this is happening in the same context. Any questions about that? All right. This is only going to go for a little bit longer, and then we're going to flip over to something else.
But the backdrop of all of that, the fight there, is because essentially, when you get into the year 1600 and beyond, and then as we get closer to the Synod of Dort, those in the leadership of the North are going to lean towards a desire for a central autonomous government that could control and put order down upon not just society as a whole, but also on the church. And you see this a lot in the context of civil wars, or in the...
I'm going to pause this one here. Any questions about that sort of broad detailed sweep of Dutch history in the late 16th and early 17th century?
Well, it certainly seems like we still struggle with a lot of the same stuff. Do we have the right here locally to decide, or does somebody in DC or somebody so far, what, away removed. For me, as a Baptist, I know it's our local congregation, we decide, but I also know, because of friends of mine in other churches, that somebody completely in another location is basically deciding what they're doing in their local congregation.
This still plays out politically and theologically today. It hasn't gone away. And in fact, if you think back to the Reformation, part of what the Reformation turned into after Luther challenges the selling of the indulgences is what? It's a question of, should everything be decided by the Bishop of Rome, who goes by the title of the Pope, or should there be more local autonomy? Remember when we talked about the Anabaptists in Switzerland, and then even Calvin when he was over in Geneva, it was very much a local authority. In fact, the local city council was the equivalent of the local church council, and it was very localized. So this tension between national, I'm going to use the term denominational, or top-down hierarchical structures versus local structures. This is not unique to the Netherlands in the late 16th and early 17th century, nor has it gone away. We still deal with this moving forward today. And, it was even an issue in the early church. Think back to the book of Acts, right? Were individual churches going to have, or were they going to look to, for example, the apostles in Jerusalem to decide things? Well, the first council that we have in Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council, they gathered together to talk about a topic. That topic was, do you have to be a Jew before you can be a Christian? And they came to a settlement of that. But that was also a question of, was that going to be decided collectively, or was that going to be decided by each individual church? And the answer, all of this all the way through, is it's always going to be, to some degree, both. The backdrop of what's happening at the same time, which is why this is also relevant. Remember, we're after 1534 now. So what's going on in England at this time, as far as the church?
The Church of England has started.
Right.
There's
The Act of Supremacy has already been issued by Henry, and the Anglican Church, the Church of England, is now separated from the Catholic Church. Remember, as we were talking about yes, yeah. Remember when we were talking about the Puritans and the Separatists? That's going on. The same thing is going on inside the English church at the same time. This is not, to some degree, this is also going on within the Lutheran church in the German territories. This is the theme of this period of time, which is why I wanted to bring it up and sort of give it a little bit of emphasis. Any questions about that? That's going to conclude most of the history part of today. So now I'm going to try to pop over into a separate video. But before I introduce it, this is a very brief introductory video. I wanted to show it in the middle of this, because when we come back and finish up the rest of the video that's on the screen now, the Dutch Revolt and Arminianism from Ryan Reeves, he's going to talk more about the theological history and what goes on with that. But I wanted to set the groundwork so that when we use the term Calvinist and we use the term Arminianist, we've at least got a common framework. So I'm going to show a really brief video here that outlines the fundamental differences at a very high level between the two positions. Most of you are familiar with the acronym that's used to describe. What's that acronym?
TULIP.
TULIP, right? Is there anybody who's never heard that before? If you've sat in anything we've talked about with me, you probably have heard that before. It's an acronym. By the way, it's a modern acronym. It actually comes out of this Synod of Dort that he referenced there that we're going to learn more about when we go back into the history part of this. But it's designed to point out the differences between the two schools of thought. And so you're going to see this. This is going to focus on the TULIP, TULIP. It's sort of ironic that eventually there will be a Synod in Dort, which is in the Netherlands. And of course, the Netherlands are associated with what flower? The tulip. They have no connection whatsoever, except just by happenstance, just so you know that. But it's one of those interesting little twists of history. So I'm going to launch the other video now, which runs for about 4 minutes. Then we're going to spend some time talking about that. There we go.
Calvinism versus Arminianism. Which view is correct? Calvinism and Arminianism are two systems of theology that attempt to explain the relationship between God's sovereignty and man's responsibility in the matter of salvation. Calvinism is named for John Calvin, a French theologian who lived from 1509 to 1564. Arminianism is named for Jacobus Arminius, a Dutch theologian who lived from 1560 to 1609. Both systems can be summarized with 5 points. Calvinism holds to the total depravity of man, while Arminianism holds to partial depravity. Calvinism's doctrine of total depravity states that every aspect of humanity is corrupted by sin. Therefore, human beings are unable to come to God on their own accord. Partial depravity states that every aspect of humanity is tainted by sin, but not to the extent that human beings are unable to place faith in God of their own accord. Note, classical Arminianism rejects partial depravity and holds a view very close to Calvinistic total depravity, although the extent and meaning of the depravity are debated in Arminian circles. In general, Arminians believe that there is an intermediate state between total depravity and salvation. In this state, made possible by prevenient grace, the sinner is being drawn to Christ and has the God-given ability to choose salvation. Calvinism includes the belief that election is unconditional, while Arminianism believes in conditional election. Unconditional election is the view that God elects individuals to salvation based entirely on His will, not on anything inherently worthy in the individual. Conditional election states that God elects individuals to salvation based on His foreknowledge of who will believe in Christ unto salvation, thereby on the condition that the individual chooses God.
Going back to our discussion last week, this is the passage in Romans, right? Those He foreknew, He predestined, right? Remember that conversation? So here in conditional election, understand the TULIP, the TULIP describes the Calvinistic position. So the other part is in contrast to that. The letters go with the Calvin side, not the Arminian side. And we'll see the irony of that later in terms of the Synod of Dort and how it comes out. But so the T was total depravity, which means what? How depraved are we?
Completely.
Which means we have zero ability to choose God. God is the first actor in everything that relates to our salvation. Versus partial depravity, which says we're depraved, we're in a sinful state, but that we at least have enough ability to trust in God, to put our faith in Him if we choose to do so. The U stands for unconditional election, which means that, again, talking about last week, God in His sovereignty has decided, in His will, has decided who will be saved. The conditional election position of an Arminianist is that God still saves. Remember, none of this is removing God from salvation. That's an important thing to understand, and the sacrifice and the work of Christ in salvation. But that God elects which individuals are to be saved based on His foreknowledge of who will believe. So this is very important because the who will believe comes in, which implies what?
Some won't believe.
Some won't believe. It definitely implies that. It also means that there is a decision to believe by those who are going to be saved. And so this concept that exists here, we're going to get into a little bit later when we talk about grace, the irresistible grace, is that in order to have salvation, grace is required. Do we all agree upon that? Yeah. It's God's grace that provides salvation. It's faith and grace. Sola fides from the Reformation, faith alone is an important part of that. The question of the grace between these two positions is there's saving grace. So let me just use that as a term. The grace that is salvation is the actual thing that saves you. Arminians hold the position that there's something known as prevenient grace that God provides. Has anybody ever heard that term before?
You do.
Okay. Prevenient grace is just enough grace to get you to the point that you can actually decide. It's a precursor to saving grace. In other words, the Arminius position is that God gives you enough grace to be able, even though you're depraved, gives you enough grace to be able to make the choice for salvation. Does that make sense? It seems like a very fine line, but to those that are in this debate, it's an important consideration.
Oh,
Okay. And so that becomes the question of unconditional election versus conditional election. Is God's election, God's choose to save, based at all upon our belief?
Calvinism sees the atonement as limited, while Arminianism sees it as unlimited. This is the most controversial of the 5 points. Limited atonement is the belief that Jesus only died for the elect. Unlimited atonement is the belief that Jesus died for all, but that his death is not effectual until a person receives him by faith. Calvinism includes the belief that God's grace.
Let me back that up a little bit. Let me get back to the slide.
Doesn't Christ say that he died for all?
Yeah, so there are verses that says that God wills that all should be saved, right? There are verses that say Christ died for all. So how in the world would a Calvinist end up with this idea that the atonement being the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ that provides salvation, how would they come up with the idea that it is somehow limited?
Because of the passage in Romans that says he foreknew, and those are who he chose.
It flows from that.
Maybe the verse 2 that says, you did not choose me, I chose you.
Correct. Again, all of this comes, I make this point over and over again because I think it's important to make. All of this has both positions, both sides of this debate have verses that they can point to that are strong supporters for their position, but also verses that seem to contradict their position. So it is true. This is probably by far the most argued point of the 5, the fact that the atonement was limited. Because again, there's the specific scripture that says Christ died for all. He didn't just die for those who are elect. Again, depending on how you determine whether God chose that or whether you even have a choice in that. But notice the difference. In unlimited atonement, Jesus did die for all, but it's not effectual until a person receives him by
Faith.
So, do you grasp the differences between these two?
Until last Sunday, I had always thought, and I'm sure, an example, you can hear things all your life, and then all of a sudden you hear it for the first time, even though you've heard it many times. But the second part of that verse where it said he chooses you, I never really paid attention to that until you brought it up. And then Donna, the other verse that she just said, I've heard it, I've just never really listened to it, I guess, because I had always just thought that Jesus died for all, and you would make the decision to believe by faith. And hearing those scriptures, I was like, wow, I've heard that. I just never really, I guess, paid attention to it.
Yeah, I agree with you, Diana. And part of what's dangerous about having a conversation about this is that we can get way down in the weeds. Yeah, because the important thing here that is true across, again, this is why I made the comment earlier about that while there are differences here, it's this far apart, not this far apart. That's a really important thing to grasp, because regardless of whether God in his sovereignty solely chooses and we have no role, or he gives us prevenient grace and so he chooses, but we do have a role. Here's the most important thing about that. Here's the thing to not get lost. God chose to save us. In his sovereignty, did he have any responsibility to do that? Not a bit. We disobeyed via Adam. God had no responsibility to save us, and yet God, through his love and his grace, chooses to save us and provide a way. We're really talking about how that works out, which is important, and it's important to how we think about things, but let's don't lose track of the most critical thing, which is that God saves through Christ, and God provided that through Christ. Exactly how it works, whether the atonement is quote unquote limited or unlimited, or whether there's prevenient grace, again, not something to just totally dismiss, but it's also something to not get so focused on that we lose track of the more important thing that comes before it. Does that make sense? Because it's easy to do that when you get down inside of this, to lose track of the big picture. God acted in salvation towards us.
Right.
And by the way, either way he acted. If you believe in, again, a full Calvinist thing that there's the elect, he is chosen, he acted in that. If you believe in the idea that he gives prevenient grace so that we can act and respond to his invitation, he acted in that. In both cases, he acted first. There's even the question of how far he acted, but he acted first. God began the process of reconciling us to him before we ever were in a position to reconcile ourselves back to him. That goes back to the depravity point of point one.
Well, I mean, I've struggled with this because I agree. I think I am totally depraved because of sin. I know that without Jesus, I can't have a relationship with God. But to think that he only died on the cross for some, I get it. He's God. He can say, yep, that's what I'm going to do. But the idea in my head that I'm going to only offer this to some people, I think
we struggle with that.
I struggle with that. And I know that you've said this before, and I struggle with this too, because it doesn't seem fair. That playground fair word about, and as Donna talked last week, he's God. It has to make sense to him. It doesn't have to make sense to me. But I do struggle with, why would he choose me and then not choose somebody else?
Right.
So I think he gives all of us, again, I've said it too, and I can be completely wrong, but I think he gives everybody the opportunity to believe in him.
So how does that fit with the situation when they were bitten by snakes and the staff was put there and they were given the opportunity to choose to look at the staff and accept healing or not? Because if you say that we have no choice and that everything is preordained, then you're basically saying God's a liar and saying that he doesn't permit people to have choice. Because there's an example right there where people were given the option, and those that chose to look upon the staff were the ones that were healed and saved from the vipers, and those that did not were not saved. So I just find that difficult to reconcile with his word and his truth.
I agree that it's difficult to reconcile with that and other examples, which is why there's been a debate over this. And then, as we talked about last week, we were looking at the passage in Romans. It clearly says, that he chose those that he foreknew. So, as we talked about at the very beginning today, our inability to understand and grasp both sides of this, or to hold what seem to us to be the contradictions about this in our head, falls on us. It doesn't fall on God.
Sure.
That's the way I resolve it.
But here's another question. When we say he chose those that he foreknew, sometimes we may not be understanding what he's telling us. Because
That's
when
true.
I think of God as existing outside of time and space, he already knows who is actually going to be there and who is not going to be there. So in
Right.
a sense, he already knows that. So for me, I guess in my brain, I'm thinking when he says he foreknew, it's because he already knows that. And it's not necessarily him choosing, but maybe that's what that means.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
he
I
knows
agree with
that.
you. I agree with you, Laurie, and I struggle with the same thing. We talked a little bit about this last week. I think you hit upon the key point there, which is that God being, we have this construct of time, so we view all of this as being linear over a time stretch, right?
Yes.
I think if we really understood, and assuming this is right, those are both big ifs, by the way. That's us again trying to wrap our minds,
Sure.
our finite minds
Sure.
around an infinite God. Is that it may be more appropriate that that passage in Roman actually says those he foreknows, because for me, we
Yes.
talked about this last week. Everything is in the eternal present for God because he's outside of the bounds of time. That's the way that I resolve this, whether it's right or wrong. It helps me in my head to resolve it that way. Is he's not bound by this causal relationship of time only flowing in one direction, A, then B, therefore C. He's got all of those things at the same time for him. And
Yes, because in my brain, I understand that God's in my history already. God's
yeah,
in my present and he's in my future. So for him, all this is already done. He is already in all places at once simultaneously.
and again, we even struggle with the language there, and I agree with exactly what you just said. For him, it's already done. I think if we really understood this, I may be wrong about this, but the way that is it for him, it's always doing.
Yes, I
It,
understand.
it's done in the sense of the way we think of done, but for him, it's done in the sense of it's present. I mean, I actually believe, and this has helped me my understanding of how salvation works, is that Jesus on the cross is always in the present for God. Just
Yes.
like the fall of Adam and Eve in the garden is always in the present for God. And those are happening at the same time.
Yes. And
And
when I use those terms literally, it's because of my existence, but that's exactly what I mean.
yeah, I think, we can't, we can intellectually grab at this. We sort of get it. The analogy that's often used there is the parade analogy. I think I've used that before. You're on the street, the parade comes by you, float,
Mm-hmm.
band, horses, car.
Yes.
But if you were above it in a balloon, you could see the whole, you'd have a different perspective. And
Mm-hmm.
that's sometimes as you
Absolutely.
describe God being outside of time. He's sort of in, above the parade. And that works a little bit. I think we can grasp that a little bit. But it's even more important than that because, yes, he's above that and can see that, but he's also on the street level encountering each thing all at the same time. And
Exactly.
we struggle with God's infinity in all kinds of ways. I agree with that. The analogy that I came to, and maybe it's a poor one that helps me a little bit with this idea of how you could even consider limited atonement. First of all, it's a construct of words. It's a construct of words. We understand that. But down on our kitchen counter are coupons. There's a lot of coupons down there right now. I saw them this morning while I was fixing my coffee.
I was sorting them out. Yep.
So one of those coupons probably gets used, right? There's going to be some coupon that gets used. Is that coupon limited or unlimited? Why?
There's a date on it that it's going to expire by.
So let's say it doesn't have an expiration date. Let's take that off. It's just a coupon. It's a no expiration date manufacturer's coupon. So it's not even store specific. Came from the manufacturer. Is it limited or unlimited?
Well, it's still limited on if I choose to buy the item or not. If I go to the store with the coupon, remember to hand it to the person. It's not going to get me any money back if I don't go to the store with me if I purchase that item.
Right. Do you see how that can sort of be a very, very bad analogy, but an analogy to look at the idea of atonement? Christ gave us the gift of salvation through God. Whether we redeem the gift through our choice, whether we have the choice to redeem the gift becomes the other issue. But whether we choose to redeem it determines whether you think of that as being the coupon for somebody who never uses it. What value does it have? In fact, it's almost as if it didn't exist, right? For them, it doesn't exist. Now, I struggle when I place that analogy over against salvation, because comparing the coupon to Jesus on the cross is a very, 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 very infinitely far stretch. But it helps me understand a little bit about, and again, the key thing here is this is about defining this. In both instances here, we're talking about the atonement. God made a way for our sins to be atoned. It's just a question of if only those who receive it, or those who are chosen to receive it, that atonement has limited effect. Either way. The question is whether it's a closed concept because of God's choice only, or whether we have a role in it. I want to play the rest of this so we can have at least this behind us before next week.
Calvinism includes the belief that God's grace is irresistible, while Arminianism says that an individual can resist the grace of God. Irresistible grace argues that when God calls a person to salvation, that person will inevitably come to salvation. Resistible grace states that God calls all to salvation, but that many people resist and reject this call. Calvinism holds to perseverance of the saints, while Arminianism holds to conditional salvation. Perseverance of the saints refers to the concept that a person who is elected by God will persevere in faith and will not permanently deny Christ or turn away from him. Conditional salvation is the view that a believer in Christ can, of his or her own free will, turn away from Christ and thereby lose salvation. Note, many Arminians deny conditional salvation and instead hold to eternal security. So, in the Calvinism versus Arminianism debate, who is correct?
We're not going to hear their opinion. We're going to ask that question of ourselves. Who's right?
God is right. Ha ha.
God is
ha.
right.
There you go, Lori.
That's a good answer, and it's also a good Sunday school answer. If you generally know the way that salvation has been doctrinally taught inside of the Baptist Church, is it purely Calvinist or purely Arminianist in terms of what you've just seen here?
Thinking maybe a little of both.
A little of both. Did somebody else say a little bit of both as well? I think that's a true answer, because we talked today even about quote unquote 5-point Calvinists, the ones that are all the way over. There's 5-point Arminians. There's a lot of people, I'm in this boat, that take elements from both of this.
Yes, I know that I didn't really know much about the specific concepts labeled Calvinism and Arminian and whatever, until we started doing the pastor search, and that came up in our conversations, and that's when I really learned a lot more about these concepts. And some of those questions were actually asked in the pastor search process. So yes, we would even ask on a 5-point scale, what are you on Calvinism? Whenever that subject would come up. So that was pretty interesting.
For example, I love P. I love
So-
perseverance of the saints. And that has traditionally been very much a Baptist doctrinal position on salvation. We refer that to as once saved, always saved. So in that respect, traditional Baptist theology, certainly Baptist theology when it comes to salvation of the last 100, 200 years, picks up the P component from Calvinism and holds on to it.
Yes. But I also think that there's something to be said for people that get in places where they actually turn their hearts and they harden them and they walk away and they never return. I think we have to leave room for people that truly reject the Lord at some point and say, I'm done, and they never come back.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of weeks ago, I don't know, maybe even a couple of months ago now, unfortunately, Don and I had to leave the sermon early, but Aaron was preaching on kind of the only unforgivable sin. And I've always been told that really the only unforgivable sin is the rejection of the gift that he's offered. Basically, I can't remember the term, but we didn't get to, and I was bad. I didn't go back in and try to rewatch the thing once we got home because I got busy doing other stuff. But basically, to deny the existence of the gift of the Holy Spirit. I remember Aaron saying there's only one thing that you can do that basically is unforgivable. But growing up, I was always told that God can forgive you of murder. God can forgive you of stealing. God can forgive you of, taking his name in vain and all of the things in the Ten Commandments. But the one thing he couldn't forgive was your inability to accept his gift. That's the unforgivable sin. But,
And then there's other elements of, again, these 5 points that we pick from the other side of the scale. I think traditionally most modern Baptists fall in the area of really struggling with the idea of limited atonement, or the idea of total depravity in the sense of we don't have the ability to choose, because we want to bring in the Arminius position of that we have a choice to either accept or reject the gift of salvation. That is also very much more of a modern Baptist take on salvation. That comes from the Arminius column. So we pick up preservation of the saints from the Calvinist column, from the tulip column. We pick up the other things from the other side. So the point that I want to make is this is not and has not been, and we're going to even see this a little bit when we carry out the rest of the historical study here to see how it grew out more in the Netherlands, how it came to be, and how it's changed over time, is that we tend to pick up both sides of this discussion. There are very few people theologically today that are hard on either 5 points one way or 5 points the other way, if that makes sense. But it is a context in which we can put it. Questions, comments? All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.